everybody, we are here for another episode of our pre-symposium panel. This is the lead up to our executive symposium in a few weeks, February 13th in Austin, Texas, on the topic how to boost morale and productivity when going through a reorg. These are things that it seems like a lot of companies are going through this time of year, and it's something that's an important topic to be talking about. We've got three great guests with us here today who are going to be at the executive symposium to share their insights, share their knowledge about the topic itself. We've got Angela, we've got Thomas, and we've got Eric. Angela, do you mind introducing yourself?
Absolutely. Angela Shaw. I am the SVP of Talent for Amplify Credit Union. Talent is what we call HR. I've been with the organization a little over 2 years, but I've been in HR for about 25. So excited to be here and talk about this topic.
Amazing. Thank you. Thomas, how about you?
Yeah, Thomas Gilman. I had a 40-year career in corporate with BP and chemical engineer, MBA. So many reorgs. Love to talk about them, what went well, what didn't go so well. So good to meet you.
Awesome. And Eric, how about you?
Great. My name is Erick Rowe, and I have a career in technology. So I've worked at Infor, Oracle, and Target, and actually currently looking for a new opportunity.
Amazing. Perfect. Thanks for sharing. And I'm Garrett. I'm the founder of Ambition in Motion. At Ambition in Motion, our vision is a world where the vast majority of people are excited to go to work. When they are there, their expectations meet reality, and when they come home, they feel fulfilled. And we believe that starts with leaders, because leaders create the experiences employees have while at work. And so we create technologies and communities to empower leaders to be their best selves for their teams. And one of the ways we build community is by having executive symposiums and leading roundtables to discuss these topics that are really important that everyone's going through. So topic is how to boost morale and productivity after a reorg. Let's put it like this. Reorgs, they seem to keep happening. And if they were all bad, I think like all the time people talk about reorgs as if it's doom and gloom and, oh my gosh, this is the worst thing ever. And obviously, if they were the worst thing ever, companies wouldn't keep doing them, but they keep happening. So there must be some redeeming qualities to a reorg. I just think it's a product of how an organization handles that reorg that makes them effective at letting people move effectively into their next role, whether they be in the company or outside of the company. I was just sharing with our panelists before, I like thinking about reorgs, especially if we're letting people go, as trying to create almost like an alumni group. So as opposed to treating people as like, hey, you're done, you're my ex, I want nothing to do with you, treating people like as if they're alumni of your organization, that they're welcome back, they're people you want to stay involved with throughout their career. And anyways, I'm excited to dive into this topic. So Angela, Thomas, Eric, first question, just to get this started off, when it comes to reorgs, what are some of the better practices that you've observed? And what are some of the not so great practices that you've observed when it comes to reorgs that either you've experienced or that you've observed?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Communication key early, often. A lot of times they don't want to, tell you what's going to happen too early. So rumors start. You got to quash those. You got to get the word out so that the undercurrent of, because it's always going to be worse in the rumor mill than it is in reality, probably. But yeah, go ahead, Angela.
Thank you. Communication too. I would totally agree with that. I think one of the biggest pieces of advice that I would always give is to be transparent as possible. But sometimes that's hard. Companies don't always do it right. They don't always give out the right information, and sometimes they actually don't do it for the right reasons. So I would actually say, as a supporting part of the organization, because I'm in HR, one of the things that I always try to do is really how do I support in a human way? So sometimes I can't affect the decision making, like how the top leaders are going to do something, but how do I affect how that message is coming across? And so I would say, as a people leader, that's something that is really important. What are the touch points? Because there should be multiple touch points, especially when we talk about communication. So how is that happening at the organization level? So like a town hall. How does that happen specifically for leaders, like middle management, who's actually having access to these employees every day? How does it happen in the departments? How does it happen in one-on-one conversations? And so like, I think a communication plan to help support those touch points is something that's very important as you go through a reorg.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Eric, how about you?
Yeah, I would add to that. So, yeah, communication is absolutely the most important thing. The one thing I think is really helpful to communicate, though, is kind of as you mentioned, Garrett, there's always reorgs. And the reason is there's not one perfect organization that solves everybody's problems. And so my perspective, and I think it's true, is that different orgs solve different problems. And more times than not, hopefully all the time, when you go from one org to a new org and a reorg, you're solving a new problem. And perhaps it's because you solved the last problem and you can kind of talk about that. Or perhaps there's a new problem. And it's kind of basically your objective, but I always like to talk about it as a problem. And if you can say that as part of your communication, you get two benefits. One is people understand why, so they don't get quite so frustrated, but it's what an amazing opportunity to talk about your strategy, which people always say they don't understand. And, this is what we're all going to get focused on. This is a problem we're going to solve. And it can become a negative to very much of a positive, kind of a rallying thing.
Man, Eric, that's such a really good point. I'm really glad that you brought up aligning on the problem. I think that is one of the biggest cruxes when it comes to a reorg is people not knowing why this decision was made. I mean, so often I'll see scenarios where CEO meets with the board says something like, we need to implement AI stat, get on it, go do AI. And you're like, cool, we're going to do something with AI. So the CEO says, hey, we're changing up all of our processes. Now we're going to follow some AI thing. We haven't really proven it out, but everybody get on it. And all the vice presidents go, sure, boss, you got it. And they don't bring up any objections whatsoever because they don't want to get fired. They've got a vacation coming up later in the month. They don't want to put that vacation on ice or risk any family living situation. So they don't do that. They go to their direct reports, the director level people. They're like, hey, we're changing our processes. We're going to AI. Now they say, why are we doing this? The CEO said it, I don't know what to say, but the CEO said we're going to do this. Directors are like, okay, cool, I guess. They go to their direct reports, individual contributors. Individual contributors are like, why are we doing this? The director says, my hands are tied. I can't do anything about it. Don't blame me. I'm just the messenger. I know this is maybe I'm being a little glib about it, but that's sometimes often the way the game of telephone works. And so the CEO's got this radically not accurate sense of hubris, like, haha, change management, I've solved this. All my vice presidents told me they were super on board for this. I've made it work. And then in reality, no one was in alignment on the problem itself. And so, Eric, when you talk about how to get people in alignment on the problem, I think that's super critical. I guess maybe the first question, the question to ask on that is, why are companies reticent to have that dialogue around with their people around what the problem is to get in alignment on that?
Sure. Yeah, I think that when people move up through an organization, it's getting things done successfully, and they want to show that I can implement AI. They don't want to say, "Ooh, I don't know, or, maybe we should slow walk this or something." That's not how they got to where they are. So those personalities, have risen based on that same hubris. And so I think it's a lot of what got them there. They continue on when a better solution might be, like you said, a deeper conversation, not just a, yeah, let's go get them kind of attitude.
The other things I would say is sometimes at the top level, there's a head in the sand approach, like not thinking about some of the repercussions of a decision that sounds like a great idea, seems like a great idea. I would also say sometimes when leaders ascend, they forget where they came from or what it was like when they weren't at the top. And then the last thing I would say is you got to have the right people around you. So Garrett, even in your example, those VPs should be speaking up and saying something. Like there should be some conversation. And it's not, no, we can't do this. It's we can do this and let's consider, right? So that I would say that those are some of the things that I've definitely seen.
Yeah, I might add to it. I think sometimes people try to be almost too nice. And so, hey, if there's a problem that we're going to solve with this new reorganization, it was Joe's problem before and he didn't solve it, and even if he's still with the company, you're throwing a little shade. And I think it's okay to talk about things. And I think pretty much any problem out there, you can talk about it in a positive way. We needed more resources. We need to double and triple, our efforts, those sorts of things. The other one too, I like is everything has pros and cons. And so I'm a huge believer, kind of going back to everyone's not organized the same way because every org has pros and cons. And so talk about the cons. And then if you think about it, in any change, if you can maximize the positive, in the new org, it's going to have some things that are better in the old world, and then take the cons and just mitigate them, right? And, we call that a silver lining sometimes if we completely hate the change, but there's some silver lining in it. And how do you kind of maximize that silver lining? And then at the end of the day, you kind of get the best of what's good, and you kind of minimize the negative aspects. But sometimes people just don't want to be so frank, because in my view, they're kind of worried about hurting someone's feelings or whatever.
That's interesting. I'm liking. It seems like there's this alignment between some of what Angela and Eric is saying there. Angela, you mentioned like this concept of leaders forgetting. The analogy I'm thinking in my head is if you've ever played hide and go seek with like a little kid, like a niece or nephew or a child or something, and they're very much not hidden at all. Like they're like, oh, I'm behind a chair, no one can see me. You're like, yes, I can definitely see you. I say that as a joke because it almost like is like these CEOs are like, I'm gonna make a really big org change, and like maybe no one will notice. Like maybe they'll be cool with it, and no one will see me. I won't be hidden or anything like that. And it's like, no, we can see you. Like just have the conversation about it. And then to back on to Eric's point, it's like, well, maybe we're trying to not hurt someone's feelings. Maybe it was Joe's job to do this thing. But I think the point you're getting to, Eric, is that it's not Joe we're criticizing. It is the outcome that we're criticizing. Like, ultimately, we need to hit a profitability margin of XYZ%. And unfortunately, we've not been able to do that. And so now we need to start looking at resolutions on how we can go about achieving that. I guess maybe what are your thoughts on incorporating the team in the solution? Like, I think people are resistant to change when they didn't have a say in what the change needed to be made. I think if everyone can be in agreement on the fact that change needs to happen, what are your thoughts on what needs to change so that we can achieve this outcome that we're trying to all get to? I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? And is that scalable? I guess that's a problem. I think that's probably the biggest reason why companies don't do this is probably not scalable, but I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I can add real quickly. Yeah, whenever you can get people's opinions in it, it's obviously good, and if you can go down one level and have a conversation, it's just good management. One best practice I've seen at one company I worked at is they just did an annual, survey. And what they would do in that survey, and some might say it almost felt planted, is they would take, certain things out of that, and then they would flip that into kind of these big, reorgs, and often things that weren't necessarily seen by everybody, but you could say, hey, we did the survey, people said this, now we're doing X. And, it kind of made that connection. So it's one of those things that you can for sure make some progress on, but you can never do the, ideal and talk to everybody, of course.
Yeah, in organizations I was in, the hesitation was how long it would take to reach down, get kind of comments and pull it back up. And then once you reach down, now there's a reorg in play. Everybody's frantic about it. What's the scope? Is it merit-based or is it just whole cut the whole division type thing? So that's the hesitation. And, I've seen it done both ways. I've seen it done well, kind of quote, well both ways and not so well. And it's more the communication, and just how they do that. But you can't take 6 months to put in a reorg. It will kill your organization.
And is that because of what you were saying before about the rumors?
Yeah, rumors and demotivation. Just kind of everybody is spending all day wondering about their job. They're looking, all the high performers are looking for other jobs, and you just, it's bad.
I would also say, while you can explain why, and that rational people understand why, I find that emotions do not understand. It doesn't matter how much time you put into communicating it. There's just a human aspect to it, right? And so when you drag it out like that, I agree with you, Thomas, that dragging it out, it only makes that worse.
That's a good point. And the human aspect of it, I think, plays a big part in it too. Because I can't remember, I think it was Eric, you were bringing this up before, of just saying, getting back to the alignment on the problem, sometimes what I'll see is organizations will set up incentive structures that ultimately are flawed. Like, let's say the goal is to increase revenue at all costs. Well, if you sell a deal at a non-profitable rate, that's not sustainable. But hey, it increased revenue. If it's not profitable, it's not profitable. Like, I don't care how you slice it and dice it. If the money you get in is less than the money you have to put out to implement said service or thing, it's not going to make any sense for the organization to move forward in that direction. And so sometimes you see reorgs happen and people are like, what? This came out of nowhere. I've been increasing my revenue consistently. But either that individual was not aware of the profitability, or maybe they were aware of the profitability, but didn't have that dialogue with the company. So how do you go about, yeah, I don't know. How do you go about getting people on the same page? And I guess, what do you encourage leadership do when they realize they've made a mistake, especially along that line of like setting incentives that ultimately became flawed?
Yeah, so in my experience, those metrics need to be not uniform. So yeah, you can have a strong push to increase revenue, like or production in the oil and gas industry. But invariably, it's like you said, let's do it in a smart way so that they need to have more than one metric to dampen that one myopic approach to something that might not be the best. But the main thing that's hard to do is to get a management or executive team that is okay with saying, yeah, we're going to redirect because that was a mistake. Very rare talent for somebody to be able to do that.
Why? Why is it so rare?
People hate to admit they made a mistake, but I do think it's a culture that you can build, a culture of trying things or a culture of um, redirecting. I do think that you can build that into your culture, but people hate to admit that they made a mistake.
Are there legal ramifications? Like I'm trying beyond just like the emotional ego tarnishing that of like, hey, y'all, my bad. I made a mistake. Going into this, I thought this was the move. I was wrong. We've learned that we got to go in this direction and it sucks and I apologize and I screwed up. But like you almost rarely see that accountability and it's just shocking and surprising me. I feel like, I don't know, the apology would go a long way. I feel like from Angela, to your point, the emotional side of things, if someone just heard a sorry, like I apologize, like I messed up, I think they would feel better. I don't know. What do you think? Do you think they feel better about it?
So in my experience, when people do that, the board replaces them. And so then the people that are in the vice president level see that and go, oh, I'm not going to do that because that's the end of my career, right? So it's kind of, they've learned from the people before them that that doesn't help you. So, yeah.
And okay, so now we're talking about boards, and I think boards are really interesting.
Mhm.
Where is the disconnect? And you, like Eric, Angela, Thomas, in your perspective, where's the disconnect between an organization's board and their actual operational executive team? And why might those gaps exist?
Because the board is not engaged in the way that they should be, or management is not giving the board the right information and they don't know how to ask for it or they're not asking for it. So the board is governance. I mean, they should be getting finance information whenever they have board meetings, whether that's monthly or whatever that is. And they should be digging into that to know.
And this is obviously a complicated issue, and perhaps this is a bit idealistic, but my perspective, and I agree 100% with Thomas's point that people accept culpability and then they may be gone real quick. My answer to that problem is they kind of wait too long. So I would kind of double down on the communication. And I think if a board or a boss or CEO or whatever level you are in the organization, if they see you accept responsibility and say, hey, we're course correcting early enough in the process, then you kind of get credit for it and you're actually seen as positive and you can kind of go ahead and make the changes. Where too often, it's like a year and everybody knows. And by the time that you accept the culpability for it, it's time to move on. It's almost like a last-ditch effort. So I would try to double down on communicating earlier. And I've definitely seen it in some organizations that I've been in, and they maybe use words like oversteer. They'll say, you know what, we were all set on revenue. We really hit these numbers, but I think we oversteered a little bit in being aggressive and, selling some deals that we're not able to execute on completely. And so now we're adding these new metrics to it. And I think you can explain it in a positive way, but it certainly is complicated.
And this brings up one of my main reasons of why I think reorgs happen is to make it so you can't do apples to apples. So we had a functional organization. We kind of oversteered, like Eric said, but now we've reorged. So it's hard to say whether that worked or not while I go on to this other thing. And so it's just a big, you can't see if they did well for a good year or two. That buys them time to try something else. And I think reorgs happen for that very reason, to obfuscate what the baseline is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I like that. That's interesting. I want to move into more of like the topic of this, which is how to boost morale and productivity after a reorg. So with that being said, I'd be curious to know what are some best practices? What are some worst practices? I'd be curious to know what are some like worst practices that you've observed when it comes to a reorg. I don't know. Sometimes I feel like I don't know why this is the analogy I come up with, but it's like a hostage movie where, you know, the bad guys have a series of hostages and, you know, they think that there's going to be some trade-off or something and they're going to all be saved. And then all of a sudden the bad guys kill three hostages or something. They're like, well, that was weird. Why am I still alive? And what value do I hold in this whole negotiation thing? Because three people were just killed off and now I'm left. And I don't necessarily know what my role is in this entire whole situation here. I thought I had agency. I don't know if I have so much agency anymore. That's a silly analogy, but I'd be curious to know what are things that you've seen in terms of worst practices, and what are some things that you've seen as good practices when, I don't know, keeping people back excited and engaged when a reorg does occur.
I would say not ever talking about it again. Like acting like after the day it happened, like that's it. Those people never existed. I think definitely seeing that. And then I would say going forward, not involving employees in decision making or talking about what happens going forward would be two things that I would say that I've seen.
Yeah, I've seen reorgs that were not in any way merit-based, just whole, segments, or like, hey, we have to cut 20%. It might as well be alphabetic that you cut them. Nobody knows why people were cut. That is bad. Also, when you have a session with survivors' guilt, you got people in their cubicle, they don't know why they were left and now they're overworked. That is a bad reorg as well. But good reorgs, people understand why, they understand why people had to leave and why people didn't. So those were the better ones.
They were also allowed to process their feelings, and the talk about the impact on them remaining in the organization happened. Those are also good practices afterwards.
And adding to that, I would say, reorgs and reductions, they can, you can have a reorg, of course, and not reduce, but you still have winners and losers. But one thing that's really interesting is I once saw a reduction, which was significant, maybe 20%. But because the strategy kind of shifted, the team was doing way, way too much. And they kind of realized if we're getting rid of 20% of the people, obviously the strategy had to change. And so it was no longer doing 10 things, it was only doing 2 things. And, people were sad that, a good chunk of people left. But they were actually reinvigorated because, they now knew that they weren't being asked to do too much and they were going to be able to be more focused. And they kind of saw it as, leadership, making a change to be more successful. So, probably, kind of coming out of that, if you can talk about the strategy, like I said earlier, and get really, really crisp on how things are going to be different and the problems you're solving, that goes so far. But think of how many reorgs we've had, kind of like Angela mentioned, where nothing changes almost, right? And, on day 2, we just know that there's a lot less people, but we're still kind of doing the same and, nothing has really shifted. And, those are the ones that are really dangerous.
Yeah, I would say out of the 17 reorgs I was through, 3 or 4 of them were actually company mergers. And that is like a super reorg because you've got people you don't even know coming into roles. And like Eric said, some are winners, some are losers, and everything's confusing. So that's a special case of a reorg.
You know, Eric, we were talking about this before the recording, but I mean, you're not alone in this scenario. I was just chatting with the chief revenue officer yesterday, and he was saying that his company replaced their CEO. Their new CEO has come in and not spoken to a single person yet, and has just said, "Hey, this is how we're doing it. I'm bringing in some of these legacy people from previous work experiences, and this is the way it's going to go." And the chief revenue officer has been there for years, is like, "Hey man, this is what you're proposing. Like, you got to talk to us first. Like, you got to get to know your people before you implement a wide scale change." But it seems like that happens pretty regularly, where it's a my way or the highway type of scenario when it comes to new executives coming into place. How do you combat that? How do you try to level set when you got a very high conviction executive who says, "This is haven't spoken to anybody, but I feel pretty good. Let's roll here because this is what worked before for my previous organizations, whether they were in the same industry or not."
I mean, honestly, anybody who comes in like that is not listening, Garrett. And it's probably nothing you can do. It's going to be bad. But what I would say is if it's a reasonable person and not coming in steamrolling to that extent, obviously for me, always coming from a people focus, I want to talk about team unity and culture and like get that person's idea around what type of culture they're looking to have, merging these legacy people they want to bring in and who we already have here. And I think that's a really important part of the conversation. So, what are we looking to be and represent as a culture and through our team unity? It's always, I feel like, a good conversation to have.
Yeah. You wonder who in HR hired that guy, right, Angela?
It was the
Yeah,
board.
the hiring of CEOs, maybe he's such a winner that that's what they want that. It's like, what were the criteria for which the CEO joined the organization to pull that? Because odds are it's not going to work out good. It's unusual that that would work.
Eric, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, nothing really, Chris. Just that sometimes change is good, right? And you kind of have maybe perhaps the CEO has a change, mission, and he's really trying to change the culture, kind of in a big way, and kind of believes, hey, the group that I was in before, these people kind of brought this particular energy, etc. To the table that, is kind of lacking, energy, all kinds of different dimensions, right? And so I think sometimes change is good as a whole. You just have to kind of balance that, of course, with, kind of long-term thinking and, making sure that you, also kind of have, assets that you're continuing to grow and develop.
I do think change is good, Eric, but ruffling everybody's feathers when you come in initially, like there is no way that's going to be good. Like I just find it hard to believe there's going to be much good come out of that.
Well, the word that is just screaming out to me from this panel is accountability. Accountability is like if there's an accountability imbalance. Seems like the people at the top have very little reason to be accountable because why do I need to be accountable? The board approved me, they hired me, therefore I passed the test. Everybody else should just fall in line like dominoes. But people aren't dominoes. There are a lot of emotional and just real aspects to just, I don't know, the change that needs to occur going forward. But regardless, when a reorg happens and a change is going on, are there any practical tips that you would suggest leaders enact when it comes to getting that buy-in? So I gave the fun scenario of the CEO sharing a change, let's say to AI, and the VP saying, "You got it, boss." And they're like, "I've got no idea why we're doing this." And then the directors are like, "What the heck? Why are we doing this?" The VP say the CEO said so. And then their direct reports, individual contributors are like, "What's going on?" They say, "Don't kill the messenger." Are there practical tips that you would suggest executive teams implement to ensure that change is enacted effectively and successfully throughout the organization?
Yeah, I think what Angela said about making sure you keep track of what happens after. So, there's all the communication leading up to the thing, but you got to make sure that they know that, yeah, these changes, here's the good results about them. Here's some things that we still need to work on. But, I think that was so good that she mentioned that, Yeah, you don't stop communicating when it happens. That now the work is starting to make sure that everybody's on board, and that's probably the biggest motivational after the fact.
Something that we did in real time in 2022 when we had some layoffs that led to some reorging, we gave our employees something else to concentrate on, which was our culture, but we were very specific about what in our culture. So one of our tenets is social impact. And so we put together a huge plan to encourage our employees to lean into their social impact. So most often people come work at our organization because credit unions are better than banks, and we have this connection to the community. And so how do we concentrate on that, right? And so we had some things already in place, but we really put a lot into, hey, this is how we reward you for interacting with your community as a community leader. When you volunteer hours, giving them hours, celebrating it. We created contests. We gave out t-shirts, take a picture in your volunteer t-shirt. And it sounds simple, but it had such a huge impact on our organization that has lasted until today. And our employees are still very excited about the new things we come up with related to social impact because they believe that that speaks to who we are as an organization past our layoffs, our reorgs, what's going on in the market and interest rates and all these other things that we could be consumed with all day, every single day. And so that is what I would say. Give your employees something else positive to concentrate on. It doesn't have to be social impact, but what is it? And I think that you should be intentional in thinking about that.
Playing devil's advocate, though, I, you know, I mean, I like the idea of investing in culture, especially when you've had to go through a reorg, but part of me feels like, to Thomas's point about rumors, you're not going to squelch the rumors with t-shirts and volunteer days when you've lost 20% of your team to get the same amount of work done. Like if the same amount of work still needs to get done, but you had 10 people, now you got 8. I'm just making a example here. Like getting a t-shirt and focus on volunteering may not necessarily reduce the stress that they're feeling about, oh my gosh, I got to add 20% additional work to my plate and figure out how to get all of that done over the next, however many months as we figure this thing out.
Maybe kind of adding to Angela's point is one way to look at it is when you have a reorg, especially if it comes with reductions, but just even a reorg in itself with the winners and losers, it's a good time to remind yourself just how important leadership is, right? And so people are going to feel like they're kind of lost. They're going to realize that, hey, I might have a different boss in 2 years than I have today, and it's not my boss taking care of me; it's kind of my company. And so you really have to step up to the plate from a leadership perspective and make sure that people know that you're vested in their growth and that you're trying to help them, be successful in their role, et cetera, et cetera. Kind of all the things that are important from a leadership perspective are probably maybe 10 times more important when something like this happens.
Nice.
I'd be curious to know, what are your thoughts? Someone suggested this recently and I really liked it. What are your thoughts on this concept of having your team, your direct reports, come back to you and make an argument for why that change was being made? So essentially, like what I hear so often is a leader will be like, well, I conveyed why we're making this change and it doesn't seem like anybody's adopted. It was like, yeah, because you conveyed why to you it makes sense, but they never communicated back to you why it made sense to them. They just said, yeah, sure, boss, you got it, whatever. And so I heard someone recently suggest have your direct reports communicate an argument to you why this change is being made until you are fully convinced that they're convinced, is then they are ready to go to their direct reports to communicate that next level message. What are your thoughts? Is that a crazy idea, non-scalable, crazy wackadoodle? I don't know.
I don't know if it's a crazy idea, but I think it does start with employees understanding their value and what they bring to the table. So like they're understanding their part in the big picture, the goals or the strategic plan. So I think in order for them to be able to understand and talk about the why, they have to understand their value and their place in it. So it's certainly not a one and done conversation of telling the employee why. I think it's over time. And it also would have been the basis that would have been set even before the change happened. So how that leadership showed up in conversations with that employee all the time, not just about that change.
Yeah, I find that on a bad reorg, or not even a reorg, but a change in direction, that middle management layer can really quash it, make it unsuccessful. And maybe that's because they don't understand it. Maybe it's not to their advantage. But if executive level doesn't understand that the middle management is how to implement things, then they're starting off in a place that's probably going to be unsuccessful. Because if a middle manager kind of doesn't want to do something, it's probably not going to get done.
I hadn't heard it. I personally kind of like it a lot. One of the things I've seen at companies is everyone's always talking about strategy, but then if you ask people, in a survey, do they understand the strategy? They often say no, right? And so having it's kind of that expression that the best way to learn something is to teach something. And so I've never done it, but I think it's a fantastic idea. You're essentially asking your next level of manager to teach it to you, which they're going to have to internalize it. And it's probably going to show some issues where they may not get it. And, back to the fact that communication is so important, it's probably, you got to have those conversations, right? Well, I know that you don't like it because X, Y, and Z, but do you see these reasons? And, it's just better to talk through those issues than not talk through them.
Well, yeah, and to that point, it creates objectivity for the leader because, we just, kind of talked about this before. Objectivity diminishes the higher anyone goes in any organizational hierarchy. When you're like, your direct reports say to you, like, you got it, boss, we're on it. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're on it or they got it or they're very much in tune. They just want to tell you whatever they think you want to hear to just end the conversation quickly and then go off on their merry way. Whereas, Eric, to your point, having them reiterate it may illuminate, oh my gosh, I didn't fully understand this aspect of the strategy here. Let's walk and talk through it. And then all of a sudden they become more conscientious of it. And like they're more equipped to handle the questions that their direct reports are going to have. Because Thomas, I think to your point, middle managers are the key to successful adoption of any change initiative you want to have, because they are the key to every other individual contributor in the company. And if they're not on board, forget about it.
Right.
And the one thing I would say to that, Garrett, I agree with you, but that middle manager wanting to move on and be done with the conversation says something about that middle manager.
Yeah.
So leadership goes both ways. So yeah, as the big leader, you're trying to make sure you're imparting the right information and you're having these conversations, but that manager reporting to their manager also needs to have some stake in the game.
Yeah.
That's a good point. But I think to Thomas's point before about boards tending to let go of senior leaders when they admit mistakes, I think like a next level down scenario is middle managers getting let go because their VPs above them are like, you're taking way too long for you to digest this information. And so I just can't handle this right now. So I'm going to replace you with someone who can digest it faster and then go out and implement. And that's not that the next person may not digest it faster. They just might say like, you got it, boss, I'm on it. And then not know what's going on. They just told them what they wanted to hear.
Right. So what's interesting about this is, it's kind of like a cultural thing now where people aren't being straight with each other. People aren't accountable. But as you reorg, it's really hard to get your culture solidified. The more you reorg, the more the culture kind of gets loose. And so you can be in this constant situation where your culture is not really solidified in a positive way. And, the next reorg's right around the corner, you live in chaos. So that's a bad thing.
I like it. Y'all, this was a good pre-symposium panel. I feel like we covered a lot of ground in this conversation, from culture to team adoption to executive accountability. I think we really covered a lot of ground. If you're watching this and you're thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, I'd love to meet with these three great leaders, come to our executive symposium on February 13th in Austin, Texas. We'll be discussing this and much more, debating, learning, chatting about how to boost morale and productivity after a reorg from 5 to 8 p.m. We'd love to see you there. I will post in the comments of this video or the chat of this video, the RSVP link. We'd love to see you there. Angela, Thomas, Eric, thanks for your time today. Have a great rest of your day.